Over the weekend, a series of deadly tornadoes swept through Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Illinois, Missouri, and Mississippi, though the vast majority of damage and fatalities has been seen in Kentucky. Governor Andy Beshear told NPR yesterday that more than 80 people have died in the state so far and projects the death toll to surpass 100. President Biden is expected to travel to Kentucky this week and approved emergency federal assistance Saturday morning after the governor declared a state of emergency.
Search and rescue efforts continue as the extent of the damage from the tornadoes that ripped through the state is still being assessed. Neighborhoods full of family homes completely ravaged in this Kentucky town. Meanwhile, critics are leveling blows against Kentucky Senator Rand Paul amid the tragedy. Paul has requested federal aid for his state in the wake of the devastation, though many on social media were quick to draw comparisons to his previous votes against several large relief bills. Team Rising is here to discuss. Democratic strategist and owner of JC Strategies, Jennifer Holdsworth-Karp, and Republican strategist Malik Abdul join us now to weigh in on the situation. Malik, as Congress continues to debate the Build Back Better Act, which would include the biggest climate investment in congressional history, actually in the history of probably any legislation around the world, do you think that this will play into the conversation here in Washington, which relatedly has had a very creepily warm December? Like it's strange how nice it has been here and is kind of related to the tornadoes that we saw.
I think that the conversation around climate change and infrastructure, I think part of what happened initially is that Democrats dropped the ball as far as messaging, because now we're calling it the Build Back Better plan, which makes sense. But initially, this was the same thing that we were referring to as human infrastructure. The interesting thing about the Rand Paul conversation is that when I first heard it, I thought to myself, I said, oh, wow, Congress came back and voted on a bill over the weekend. And then I realized that actually didn't happen. And what Rand Paul did is something that's rather perfunctory. He sent Joe Biden a piece of mail or email, whatever, saying essentially approve Governor Beshear's emergency declaration relief. That's all it was. So unless I'm wrong, I stand to be corrected if I am. But Rand Paul this wasn't in reference to a bill, and he did vote against previous bills. But what we're talking about here is him sending a letter to the President of the United States, which is similar to what he did last year in March when he sent a letter to Donald Trump requesting emergency relief in response to the pandemic. So I think I got that right on that. I don't think that they are talking about the same thing when they talk about a bill versus sending a letter to the President of the United States.
Jennifer, what do you think? Is it fair to knock Senator Paul for this? I think he would say that, look, he's opposed the previous relief funding in other cases, but he's because they were additional sort of additional charges. He would have what he said is he would support cutting something from the budget elsewhere and then using that money for relief funding instead of whatever it was going toward.
All right. Well, so I want to express my sincere sympathy to everybody who lost their life and the communities that are absolutely reeling from this tragedy. I hate that we have to talk about the politics of this at this moment. And in fact, a lot of people on Twitter and a lot of people in conversation are lamenting the fact that anybody is pointing out the hypocrisy of Rand Paul. But it's something that needs to be done right now, because not only is he a hypocrite in terms of requesting federal aid for these kind of disasters, but he is a hypocrite when it comes to the Build Back Better bill. And as much as I adore my learned colleague here, Malik, I have to take extreme exception with the notion that Democrats have dropped the ball on the climate conversation when almost the entirety of the Republican caucus denies climate science in and of itself. Until Rand Paul comes out explicitly about the fact that climate change is causing these type of disasters across America, admits that we are burning, we are drowning, and there is no amount of money enough that we could spend in order to fix these problems on planet Earth, then I think it's extremely rich for somebody to blame Democrats about haggling over the price of a bill we are trying to pass in order to mitigate these kind of disasters. People are dead. Families are grieving. And there are things we can do to mitigate that in the future. That is what we need to talk about. And we need to hold anybody to task who doesn't agree with that.
Dozens of people at a Kentucky candle factory were among the victims of the fatal tornadoes. Kentucky District Judge Brian Crick was killed in Warren County, and 6 people died at an Amazon distribution center in Illinois. This tragedy is putting a focus on Amazon's phone ban, which prohibits workers from bringing their smartphones into warehouses, meaning they could potentially miss the tornado warnings during work hours. Malik, would you like to respond to anything Jennifer said, or anything out of Kentucky?
Yeah, I did actually check to verify. So what Rand Paul did is exactly what I said. He sent a letter to President Biden, which is the same thing that he did to President Trump when he sent a letter in March of last year. There was no bill that Congress voted on. So I think we should actually put that out there. And the media is making a big deal out of this when it's really a letter versus a bill. And Rand Paul should rightly be criticized for not voting against disaster relief bills. But that's not the same as what any member of Congress does when sending a letter to the President of the United States. As far as the Amazon, I'm a little on the fence, and part of this is because I know people in the defense industry who can't take phones into certain parts of their buildings or something like that. But I absolutely sympathize with the notion that maybe they should. I'm not opposed to it at all, but I can understand why a company like Amazon would not allow you to carry phones onto the floor. Not saying that they shouldn't get rid of that policy, because, you know, your people should be informed, but I could see why they did it. But if they change it, I would be totally open to that.
You know, Jennifer, climate change is real and it's happening and it's a problem, and Republicans who deny it entirely are wrong. That's one thing. But you said we should be willing to spend. I think you literally said infinite amount of money on it. That's not we have to have a reasonable discussion about there are trade-offs to everything, right? If we make everything more expensive and then people can't afford food, that would be bad. And I understand that some people in some scientists, some in the climate change movement assert that climate change is making severe weather events worse or more frequent. I think that's that is more debated. You might say that you think it one way and other people think it. It's more under debate than the idea that climate change is happening at all, which I agree really isn't up for debate. But climate change activists often, try to tie every time there's a severe storm or a hurricane or an earthquake or a tornado and say, well, this is what you get when you have climate change. Of course, the extreme weather events have always been happening. Maybe there's some people saying they're getting somewhat worse. I don't know that that's absolutely proven. So I hesitate to use. I don't think every tragedy should be a argument for doing some dramatic new policy change de facto. That's how I would respond to that.
One point I can add to that,
right,
Jennifer, before you just want to add one little thing. The IPCC, the major thing that they came out with this year was that now they have scientific consensus on the notion that extreme weather events have increased and are due to climate change that. So that IPCC is now previously they had said we're not so sure. We think that this is happening. Now in their most recent report they said yes, these extreme events, for instance tornadoes in December in Kentucky, are related to climate change. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, and I was just going to point out that there is consensus now, and while hyperbole about spending infinite amount of money, there are infinite amount of things that we can accomplish together in order to mitigate this. And there were anomalies in the past. There were indications that we were headed this way. I may be dating myself, but for those of you who remember Hurricane Andrew and Hurricane Hugo and other warning signs that we were headed in this climate disaster direction, and everybody made fun of Al Gore when and all he wanted to focus on was global warming, after he lost the election in 2000, we collectively have not had the political will to do what's necessary to move this forward. And in terms of Amazon, obviously it was the horrendous and complete wrong decision not to allow workers to have their phones. Although I will point out that it started not as a security measure, but as a safety measure for the amount of heavy machinery that is used in that factory. It was required so that it was not distracted. We think about how originally students weren't allowed to have their cell phones in school, and then reversed that decision because of all of the school shootings. We wanted to make sure that they had the ability to call 911 at any given turn. And Amazon reversed their decision at the beginning of the pandemic to make sure that their workers could be in touch with family members. So I am not defending Amazon by any stretch of the imagination. Whenever there's a decision to be made, you can guarantee that it's probably the wrong one. But in this case, it started as a safety measure, and they reversed it at the beginning of the pandemic. So I'm not entirely sure it was still in place during this actual event. But be that as it may, it's an extraordinary tragedy that we need to be focusing on in terms of getting help to the families, getting help to the communities as soon as possible. If we as a country cannot collectively come together and help our fellow person in times of extreme weather event tragedy, then I think all the conversations we're having around democracy in Washington are going to be lost on that.
Jennifer Malik, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
We'll have more Rising right after this.